Good afternoon, everybody. Really glad to see all of you in attendance at today's session. Thank you all for being here. Especially thank you to Quinn Solis for being our facilitator for today. So today this is the Queer and Trans 101 seminar that's being facilitated by Quinn Solis, the Associate Director of LGBT Resources at the RCSGD. I'm really happy to get to have this conversation together today. I want to just note that we have our participants are our AS senators and AS boards, commissions, and units. So we have a really nice cross-section, Quinn, of associated students here with us today. For our participants, I want to just remind us about a couple of things. Really want to encourage you to please make the most out of this opportunity, participate as much as you can and as much as you're willing and comfortable in doing. I want to ask you to make sure to have the respect and sensitivity for both the content that's being discussed in this session and also for yourselves and for your peers. It is really important that in all of these conversations, not just in this training, but in all the trainings that we're doing together, that we're holding space for ourselves and for each other to be able to be healthy and safe in these environments. That this is also, of course, a learning environment, and so that we hope that you take great things out of this and take it back into the rest of the world with you. A couple of points in terms of housekeeping. I want to just note that we are recording this session as we are recording all sessions that we're doing for the AS trainings. We don't want the recording of the session to be an impediment or a barrier for your participation. And so want to just let you know that we are recording. If you did feel like you shared some things that you wished that you do not want to have recorded, you can let us know after the fact and we can not post that recording online just to make sure that we're taking another opportunity to be sensitive to whatever the content is. But we really do want to offer these recordings online for folks who couldn't participate with us and to be able to kind of continue having these conversations. There will be a link posted on the chat towards the end of the session as a reminder that you need to check out of the session by using that link so that we can record your participation in this session. And that is all of the housekeeping I have. I want to just make sure, Quinn, that we have you as the host and not the co-host right now. Are we good with that?
I believe so.
Perfect, wonderful. Then on that note, I am very happy to turn this over to Quinn.
Awesome, thank you. And my co-facilitator just hopped on, so I'll have him introduce himself in just a second. But I'm like, is it morning? No, it is afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for zooming in. I know Zoomland is not our favorite platform, but here we are trying to make the most of it. So I'm gonna start sharing my screen and we'll get started. Thank you so much for that introduction. But again, I wanted to reintroduce myself. My name is Quinn Solis. I use they, them pronouns, and I'm the Associate Director for the Resource Center for Sexual and Gender Diversity. And I'll be spending the next 2 hours with you talking about LGBTQ folks at UCSB and how your role as a senator can really support our community. And I'm gonna hand it over to Craig, my co-facilitator.
Hi there, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Craig Leitz. I use he and him pronouns. I'm the director of the RCSGD and really excited to spend some time with you this afternoon.
Right. And as I was said in the beginning, we are going through our Queer and Trans 101 seminar. It's our very first seminar of a 3-part series currently. So I do have y'all in gallery mode. So if you maybe can put a thumbs up or raise your hand. Has anyone taken a safe zone training before? I don't see that many. All right, great. So when I first came in to UCSB as my role as the Associate Director in January 2019, my very first project was working with our student staff at the time to really look at our education initiatives and see how we can rebrand them and make them more tailored specifically to UCSB and how they can support LGBTQ folks. So the first thing that we did was change the name. Typically, you might have heard Safe Zone trainings before. Those are typically LGBTQ competency trainings. And our students at the time were like, Quinn, we want to change the name because we can't promise a safe space or a safe zone for students in 2 hours, and sometimes even less, right? So we we really looked at the title and tried to rebrand and really say, okay, what do we want to teach in our education initiatives? So we came up with Queer, Trans, Identities, and Experience seminars, or QTs. We do love our acronyms at UCSB. And this is our logo. Our program coordinator, Dwayne Mosby, created this logo and also our 20th anniversary logo. So I wanted to give you a little bit of a history of how our seminars came to be. They're technically Safe Zone trainings, but we have rebranded. And this is our very first seminar of a 3-part series. Like I said, our next one is our Trans 101 seminar that dives more into trans identities and experiences on campus. And our very last seminar is our UndocuQueer, UndocuTrans seminar that we co-facilitate with Undocumented Student Services. If you are interested in taking those seminars, we will be offering some in the fall. So if you follow us on social media or get our newsletter, you'll get information on when those are hosted so you can register for those. And then we'll get started. So before we dive into the agenda, I do want to just say that please take care of your body. We don't have a formal break, as you can see in this agenda. So please, like, if you need to go turn off your camera, go grab some water, go grab a snack, feel free to do so. You know how to take care of your body as much so, and you'll get access to this as a PDF as well. So of course it will be recorded, so you will be able to listen to the recording, but also you'll be able to have this presentation as a PDF. So please share that with folks around you, because me and Craig are only 2 people and cannot, unfortunately, educate every single person on our campus. So if you can share this information widely, that would be really beneficial for us. And I cannot see the chat because I'm sharing my screen. So Craig will be the one monitoring the chat. So we do acknowledge that there are LGBTQ folks on this call and would want to maybe share their identities, their experience on campus, or just add on to the conversation. And we really do welcome that, because me and Craig, as we'll talk about in just a second, we don't consider ourselves experts at all about LGBTQ stuff. We know a little bit about a little bit, but we really are community informed. So if you do want to add on to the conversation, feel free to do that in the chat. And if you want to add to the conversation but want to remain anonymous, feel free to send Craig a private message, and Craig will share either your question or your comment with the rest of us. And I will hand it over to Craig.
All right, thank you, Quinn. Yeah, so I already saw there was a question in the chat about our social media. So I put Facebook and Instagram in there. We're also on Twitter. We also have a YouTube channel that I will, as I have time throughout, add those to the chat as well. There was also a question posed. So this is scheduled to be done at 4 p.m. So this is a 2-hour training, a little bit less now that we've gotten started, but we are planning to be done by 4. So you see our agenda here. These are all the topics that we're hoping to get through. It is a lot of content. There is a lot to know. And so we will dive right in. As Quinn said, if you have questions, either send it to everyone through the chat or you can send it to me privately, and we will make sure that we get to your questions. You're muted.
Thank you. So before we dive into the content, we wanted to do an acknowledgement. Now, this is full transparency, something very new to us as the RCSGD, because we acknowledge that in the past we have not acknowledged what land we are on at UCSB. So we are trying to highlight our Indigenous community members at UCSB. So typically, if we were in person, we would have someone in the audience read it, but I am going to read it, and then we'll talk a little bit more about it. Before we commence, we wish to acknowledge the traditional custodians of this place and all land upon which the university and we as individuals are located. We pay our respects to the Chumash elders, past, present, and future, for they hold the memories, the traditions, and the culture of these areas, which have become a place of learning for people from all over the world. So we understand that there are some of you that are not in Santa Barbara currently, so we understand that you might not be occupying Chumash land. So we really want to encourage you, if you don't know what land you're occupying and you're on, we have a website, a Native Lands website. It's linked here on this slide. Feel free to click on that. It's hyperlinked, and do some research, because it's really important that we know what land we occupy, because oftentimes higher education, what we'll talk more about throughout this presentation, was not made for LGBTQ folks. It was not made for Indigenous folks. It was not made for Black and other POC students, right? So we need to really acknowledge how can we uplift all of these communities as we do our work at UCSB, especially right now with COVID-19 happening. There's a lot of Indigenous communities in the United States that are being highly disproportionately impacted by COVID-19. And they're not getting a lot of resources out in the reservation. So I really encourage you to join us in this work and making sure that we are uplifting and asking our Indigenous community members, students, staff, and faculty, what do you need from me? What do you need from us as AS, as the RCSGD, as a UCSB community, to make sure that you feel like you are thriving at UCSB, and asking yourself, are Indigenous folks at the table when you're making decisions? If not, how can we get them at the table? And those are conversations that we're having as the RCSGD. And we're very fortunate at UCSB to have the American Indian Cultural Resource Center through EOP. They do amazing resources. They have amazing resources. They do amazing events and community building for Indigenous communities. And we also have a Two-Spirit community that are typically LGBTQ Indigenous folks that we also need to make sure that are at the table. So if you don't know whose land you are on, really encourage you to start there and start really connecting to this American Indian Cultural Resource Center and seeing how you can collaborate with them to make sure that our Indigenous communities feel seen on our campus and have the resources so they can thrive just like all of us who are not Indigenous. Craig, do you have anything else to add to this slide?
So we want to talk about introductions, but I will assure you all, given how many of you that there are, we will not be asking you all to turn on your camera or unmute yourself to do an introduction. What we would invite you to do, if you would like, is to put this information in the chat. A pro tip that I will share, in case you don't know it already, is when you've done a line of text, if you hold the shift key and then hit enter, instead of it sending the chat to the entire group, it will let you go to the next line. So you can put all of this information in and then hit enter and it will send it to everyone. So if you feel comfortable, you can share your name, your pronouns. The most common pronouns that we see at UCSB are they, them, and theirs, she, her, and hers, he, him, and his, and z's, here, and here's. And then what is your position within Associated Students? What is it that you do? Many of you may already know each other, and if you don't, that might be helpful. But I think something that we all will need to get used to, let me know if my pro tip is not working. I got that feedback on another one, but I did it myself, and so I don't know if it's not working. Let me know, so then I won't share that as a pro tip in the future. But we wanted to share this introduction slide in part so you could share your information in the chat. When we were doing orientation sessions this summer, we found that students were very hesitant to turn on their camera. And so we tried to give people the opportunity to put it into the chat so we could still know who was in the room, right? Even if they didn't want to turn on their camera. And so that's something that you might be experiencing during your work in this coming term. You know, LGBTQ students might not be in supportive homes. They might not be able to engage in the same way others of us are. And so using the chat in this way is a good option for helping people to engage and feel like they're part of the conversation outside of having, how many of you are there? 93 participants right now. All of us individually introducing ourselves would take days. So this might be something that you would use in the work that you're doing this year through your Associated Students position. We also encourage you, and Quinn will talk about this a little bit more, but if you want people to share their pronouns, having them visible on a screen as a reminder to what you're asking will be useful for students who might not know or be as familiar with pronouns. And as I said, Quinn will talk a little bit more about that, so I'm not going to say too much more now on that topic, but thank you all so much. Oh my gosh, there are so many of you. You're so wonderful sharing your information in the chat right now. We really appreciate it.
So you might have already received the pre-assessment that came with the Zoom information for this seminar. So if you are interested in learning more about the learning outcomes or the goals that we hope that you get out of today, they're here, but we won't go too much into them, but you'll have them as a PDF if you are interested to learn more about the learning outcomes.
So we want to start by talking through some agreements that we ask for participants who go through our QDs to agree to. So the first being that, we only have 2 hours together. And I think that first one is specifically from the UndocuQueer training. So imagine that just says, remove the undocumented immigrants' identities and experiences, just LGBTQIA+ identities and experiences. But in 2 hours, we cannot tell you everything there is to know about LGBTQ people. And in part because Quinn and I don't know everything there is to know about LGBTQ people. We are just 2 individual queer and trans folks who know our own experience. And while we do this work 40 hours a week, we're always learning, right? And so you will not know everything there is to know at 4 p.m. We hope, though, moving into the second agreement, that this is hopefully one stop on your journey, right? That you will continue to know more and learn more about LGBTQ people, whether that's through social media, whether that's through our CSGD events, whether that's through regular old media, right? That we hope that you will continue to learn more about the community and that your education will be ongoing. Given this unique format here in Zoom, folks, you should decide what you feel comfortable sharing or not. But if someone does share a personal example, we hope that the specifics of that content will stay in this virtual space that we're all in together. And that you won't say, oh, well, I was at this training, and let's say Quinn was a participant, and Quinn Solis said this very specific thing, right, that they had this experience. Whereas what you could take is what you learned. Like, oh, a participant in this workshop I went to shared about their experience, and what I learned from that was this, right? So we want to make sure we're taking the learning, but not folks specific information. One thing that we really believe in the RCSGD is that that individuals are experts regarding their identities, their experiences, and their marginalization. There are a lot of people who question the validity of LGBTQ people's identities and whether or not our identities are valid. Additionally, that there will be a lot of questions about LGBTQ people experiencing transphobia and homophobia, right? And so we want to make sure that when LGBTQ people tell us who they are and they tell us the experiences that they're having, particularly around discrimination or bias or hate, that we believe them and we validate and affirm those experiences and then do what we can to try and make their experience better, right? And so for you all working in Associated Students, as student leaders on campus in campus government, you might have ways that you can help to address those negative experiences that some of our students are having. If you are going to share a story from your personal life, maybe in your breakout groups that will happen during our time together, it's important to only share information if you are sharing about someone else that person would be comfortable with you sharing. And then also you should only ever refer to someone by their current name and pronouns. Perhaps you know someone in your life, a trans or non-binary person who through the course of you knowing them has gone by a different name or pronouns. We only ever refer to someone by their current name and pronouns. We should never be referring to them by past names or pronouns. Moving on to the next one, right? The purpose that we're here, the reason why we're here together is that we're hoping to create a more welcoming and inclusive and successful environment for LGBTQ people by reducing the challenges and barriers that they face on our campus, right? Those things that are preventing them from being as successful as non-LGBTQ people. And so we really appreciate you being in this project with us of making a more welcoming campus for LGBTQ people. And we hope that you will let us know at any point if there are ways that we can be helpful to you in that project. And then finally, what we want to ask you to do today is view this content through the specific lens of your work in Associated Students, right? That there are a lot of you and we can't tell each one of you individually how this content applies to your specific position. And so we're asking you to view this content through that lens. And we will provide this content to you. Please ask us specific questions if you have them But also know that we are going to deliver this information to you today and kind of trust you and rely on you to take this content and incorporate it into your work to provide a more welcoming space through your sphere of influence, through your position in AS for LGBTQ people. Know that we are always available to consult if you have specific questions or scenarios that come up, but Quinn and I, our program coordinator, Dwayne, our 2 graduate assistants, and our 9 undergraduate staff, we are a small team and can't be in all parts of campus all the time. And so we rely on people who go through these QDs to help us do the work across UCSB. So we appreciate you joining us in this effort, and please let us know at any time if there are ways that we can support you. So we're going to move into a really important framework that we use in the RCSGD. If we were together or there weren't so many of you and I could see your cameras, sorry, there's a street sweeper going by outside. I hope it's not too loud. But what I would ask you is, first, how many of you are familiar with intersectionality as a term that perhaps you have heard before? And the other question that I would ask you is if any of you saw Dr. Crenshaw when she came to campus in spring of 2018. The Multicultural Center brought her to campus, and every time I think of that, I get a little bit sad because I came to campus in July of 2018, and so I just missed Dr. Crenshaw, and it would have been so wonderful and amazing to be physically in the same space as her because she's a really important person really in the world, but also to the work that we do in higher education. So Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw is a faculty member both at UCLA School of Law as well as Columbia School of Law, and she is credited with coining the term intersectionality. So we're gonna watch a clip of this TED Talk. It's called The Urgency of Intersectionality. It's about the whole TED Talk is just under 19 minutes, so we encourage you to watch it at some point if you have the chance. But for now, we're just going to watch a clip of it where Dr. Crenshaw will tell us about how she came to coin and understand the term intersectionality. And after that, we'll talk a little bit more about how it applies to our work in the RCSGD. And I'll have Quinn start the video for us.
So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to play it, stop it, make sure the audio is working. So if you can give me a thumbs up, Craig, that would be great.
Is that gave rise to intersectionality was my chance encounter with a woman named Emma DeGraffenreid. Emma DeGraffenreid was an African-American woman, a working wife, and a mother. I actually read about Emma's story from the pages of a legal opinion written by a judge who had dismissed Emma's claim of race and gender discrimination against a local car manufacturing plant. Emma, like so many African-American women, sought better employment for her family and for others. She wanted to create a better life for her children and for her family. But she applied for a job and she was not hired. And she believed that she was not hired because she was a Black woman. Now, the judge in question dismissed Emma's suit. And the argument for dismissing the suit was that the employer did hire African Americans and the employer hired women. The real problem, though, that the judge was not willing to acknowledge was what Emma was actually trying to say, that the African Americans that were hired, usually for industrial jobs, maintenance jobs, were all men. And the women that were hired, usually for secretarial or front office work, were all white. Only if the court was able to see how these policies came together would he be able to see the double discrimination that Emma DeGraffenreid was facing. But the court refused to allow Emma to put two causes of action together to tell her story because he believed that by allowing her to do that, she would be able to have preferential treatment. She'd have an advantage by being able to have two swings at the bat when African-American men and white women only had one swing at the bat. But of course, neither either African American men or white women needed to combine a race and gender discrimination claim to tell the story of the discrimination they were experiencing. Why wasn't the real unfairness, law's refusal to protect African American women simply because their experiences weren't exactly the same as white women and African American men? Rather than broadening the frame to include African American women, the court simply tossed their case completely out of court. Now, as a student of anti-discrimination law, as a feminist, as an anti-racist, I was struck by this case. It felt to me like injustice squared. So first of all, Black women weren't allowed to work at the plant. Second of all, the court doubled down on this exclusion by making it legally inconsequential. And to boot, there was no name for this problem. And we all know that where there's no name for a problem, you can't see a problem. And when you can't see a problem, you pretty much can't solve it. Many years later, I come to recognize that the problem that Emma was facing was a framing problem. The frame that the court was using to see gender discrimination or to see race discrimination was partial, and it was distorting. For me, the challenge that I faced was trying to figure out whether there was an alternative narrative, a prism that would allow us to see Emma's dilemma, a prism that would allow us to rescue her from the cracks in the law, that would allow judges to see her story. So it occurred to me, maybe a simple analogy to an intersection might allow judges to better see Emma's dilemma. So if we think about this intersection, the roads to the intersection would be the way that the workforce was structured by race and by gender. And then the traffic in those roads would be the hiring policies and the other practices that ran through those roads. Now, because Emma was both Black and female, she was positioned precisely where those roads overlapped, experiencing the simultaneous impact of the company's gender and race traffic. The law was like that ambulance that shows up and is ready to treat Emma only if it can be shown that she was harmed on the race road or on the gender road, but not where those roads intersected. So what do you call being impacted by multiple forces and then abandoned to fend for yourself? Intersectionality seemed to do it for me. I would go on to learn that African American women, like other women of color, like other socially marginalized people all over the world, were facing all kinds of dilemmas and challenges as a consequence of intersectionality, intersections of race and gender, of heterosexism, transphobia, xenophobia, ableism. All of these social dynamics come together and create challenges that are sometimes quite unique.
So we hope you enjoyed that video. Like I said, we encourage you to watch the whole TED Talk. It is linked there when you get these slides, so you can go and watch it later if you would want to watch the whole thing. I think it's from 2016, 2018, so it's a few years old now, but still very relevant and still wonderful. We pulled this image out of the TED Talk because it reminds us of the point that we're hoping to clarify, right? That when we're thinking about LGBTQ people on campus and students in particular, we're not just talking about their gender and their sexual orientation, but we need to remember that they're full humans with other identities as well, right? Race and class and religion, and those things might lead to them experiencing marginalization in addition to their queer or trans identity, right? And so this image reminds us that there are some folks who have multiple marginal identities who, as Dr. Crenshaw says, are experiencing the simultaneous impact of multiple oppressions at the same time. And so we in the RCSGD use intersectionality to ensure that we are remembering that our students are not just queer and trans, but they're Black, Indigenous, and other people of color. They are women, they are folks with disabilities, right? And so we need to be thinking about queer and trans justice work as also racial justice work, as also disability justice work, as also immigration work, right? That all of these things matter because our LGBTQ students have all of these other identities as well, are part of all of these other communities. And so though the rest of our time together will be more focused on topics around queer and trans identities, we hope that you will always remember to think about the intersections of the multiple oppressions that folks might be experiencing and how you, through your work, cannot just be doing this queer and trans justice work that we're talking about, but also seeing that work demanding racial justice work and disability justice work, et cetera. So we hope that intersectionality is something that you will keep in mind moving forward, as you probably do already, for those of you who are already familiar with the term.
Great, so moving on, right? So the way that we approach intersectionality is very much how Craig shared, right? Is that our students are not just LGBTQ, but they're also Black folks, right? So we wouldn't be staying true to addressing intersectionality and addressing the multiple systems of oppression if we do not talk in some length about Black Lives Matter. And most of you are probably familiar about this movement and have been pretty involved already in doing and demanding justice for Black folks that have been experiencing police brutality. But for folks who are not so familiar how this movement started, I just wanted to share a little bit about the history, and then we'll talk about exactly what's on this slide. So Black Lives Matter is a movement fighting for equality, freedom, liberation, and justice, specifically for Black folks, not just in the United States, but internationally. This movement was officially started in 2013 by activists Alicia Garza, Patrice Cullors, and Opal Tometi as a call to action in response to the rampant police brutality and murder of Trayvon Martin in 2012. This movement is crucial to our work as the RCSGD because we cannot support LGBTQ folks without fighting to end racism and anti-Blackness. Those things are very crucial and intertwined very deeply for us at the RCSGD because there are Black LGBTQ folks on our campus. So just trigger warning, I'll be talking about murder and transphobia in just a second, but I think it's so important to acknowledge that this movement was officially started by 3 Black women, and one of them is queer. And because if you watch the rest of the intersectionality video of Dr. Crenshaw, she goes on and talks about how intersectionality impacts specifically Black women in the United States, because we oftentimes do not speak about the struggles that Black women face. It's because they face sexism, they face racism, and they face misogyny and other systems of oppression, but oftentimes they do not get the spots on the news. They don't get a lot of really social media coverage as often because of all those systems of oppression that they're facing. And I wanted to also say that that also affects our LGBTQ Black folks, particularly in 2020, there has been over 23 trans lives who have been murdered by transphobia, and most of them are Black trans women, and they are facing sexism, racism, homophobia, and trans misogyny at the same time. So again, as you are doing and still being involved in the Black Lives Matter movement, we really want to remind you that make sure that you're also uplifting Black trans women, because they really are the ones that are getting hit by all these systems of oppression. And we are starting to do that work at the RCSGD and have continued to do that. So if you do have ideas and want to collaborate on how to specifically support Black trans women on our campus and our greater community, feel free to reach out to us. And we're always, again, we cannot do this work alone. So we really do need folks, especially AS, to come and collaborate with us to make sure that we are being part of this movement of Black Lives Matter. So for folks who are wondering how to get involved with this movement, we did some hyperlinks here that are a start, not the end all be all. So the Black Lives Matter organization, the national organization, has awesome toolkits on their website. It's hyperlinked under the support the movement, and it gives you links on like, hey, these are toolkits if you're an educator. These are toolkits if you're a student. These are toolkits if you're white. These are toolkits if you're non-Black POC, to start being involved and making sure that we're addressing and ending anti-Blackness. Specifically supporting our UCSB Black LGBTQ students, we're very fortunate to have a student organization called Black Queer, which really focuses on the intersection of being Black and LGBTQ. And they wrote a statement at the end of spring quarter 2020. And there's a lot of action items on there that we all should be aware of, and make sure that we are doing them this academic year and beyond, because our Black Queer org really took the time to write down, like, this is how you can support me as a Black LGBTQ person. So it is hyperlinked there. Really encourage you to, in your senator meetings, to bring up this document and the statement, and really start seeing how can AS make sure that they are doing some of these action items. We also, as the RCSGD, with support of Black Queer, was able to create a Black LGBTQ resource page. It is hyperlinked here. It's not just for Black LGBTQ folks, but it's folks who want to support Black LGBTQ folks on our campus. It gives you a lot of videos, a lot of articles to read, really a great start to making sure that we are supporting our Black LGBTQ folks at UCSB. And one of the things that I really wanted to highlight is our intersectional approach. Again, if we haven't driven this point home, we cannot do LGBTQ work without doing racial justice work. So on June 15, 2020, the Supreme Court ruled that the Civil Rights Act of 64, protects LGBTQ folks from discrimination. This is a huge win for LGBTQ people in the United States. It's a huge win because in over 23 states before this ruling, you could get fired for being LGBTQ. So this is such a huge win for us. So LGBT folks cannot be fired for being queer and trans in the workplace. And we would have never had this win if it wasn't for every single Black person who fought tirelessly for the Civil Rights Act of 1964 to be passed. And I think this, again, is a demonstration on how we all will be liberated only when Black lives matter. And we really are, that's been our approach. And we are at the RCSGD, we're working on doing a lot of racial justice work this next academic year. So if you do want to be part of that, you want to collaborate, feel free to reach out to us. But one last thing that I will share about this intersectional approach in the Civil Rights Act ruling is that, so we have a psychologist, Dr. Meredith Merchant at CAPS, who speaks very vocally around how when our Black students thrive, we all thrive. And I think that is something that we need to keep in the forefront of our minds as we continue to do this work. Specifically, I want to take that even a step further. When Black trans women thrive, then we all will thrive. So I really encourage you to share that statement, give credit to Dr. Meredith Merchant, and really start seeing how we can collaborate together to make sure that our Black students feel that they not only can survive UCSB, but they can thrive and feel part of our campus. A few weeks ago, there was another another instance of racism that Jacob Blake experienced. And if you want to learn more on how to demand justice for Jacob Blake, he is safe. He survived the attack. So if you want to learn more about how you can demand justice for Jacob Blake, it is hyperlinked here. It's just some of the resources. It's not the end all be all, but I hope that you will have a good start. And please let us know how we can be involved with AS to make sure that we are sharing the Black Lives Matter movement and resources all throughout UCSB and our campus.
So as I mentioned about intersectionality and with Quinn talking about Black Lives Matter, right, that we hope you will keep those things in mind throughout the rest of our time together and consider how those topics will inform the other things that we'll talk about today, right? One example might be that we'll talk about pronouns because it's really important to make sure that we're referring to people by the correct pronouns, but it's also really important to make sure that we're pronouncing people's names correctly, right? And so ensuring that when someone tells us how they, what their name is and how they pronounce it, that we work really hard to pronounce it in the way they do, right? So that's one small example about how some of the topics that we're talking about can be thought about in an intersectional way, that we're not just talking about LGBTQ people, and remembering that LGBTQ people are from other marginalized identity groups as well. So we're going to move into terminology, right? And we wanted to make sure that you knew on this slide, there's a link there to a full list of terms. On our website, we have a glossary that has a whole bunch of terms. We have more terms on that glossary than we have time for today. And it's also not necessarily essential that you commit all of these terms to memory and know exactly what they mean. More so, what we'll talk about is the ways in which you can be supportive to or affirming of LGBTQ people by using good language, right? And sometimes people ask us, like, why is language so important to the LGBTQ community? Why are there so many words? Why are there so many labels? I'll give you an answer to that in a moment, but another answer that I would give to that question is the way that people talk about LGBTQ people and the community are one of the only ways that I, as a queer person before I know them better, know how they feel about LGBTQ people, right? So if someone is referring to the gay and lesbian community, that is pretty dated. That's thrown it way back, decades, right? So if someone says gay and lesbian, I'm like, okay, well, they like know something, but like maybe are not too current. Whereas if someone effortlessly, more effortlessly than I said that word, if they can effortlessly say the acronym, right, LGBT, LGBTQ, LGBTQIA+, right, then I'm like, oh, this person, like, they're good. They like know about the community. They probably have friends. They like maybe attended a workshop like this, right? So we spend time on language and ensure you know about language because it really is important to us in the community to be a signifier as to other folks' friendliness toward us as LGBTQ people. So that's why we're going to spend some time on terminology now, and I'll ask Quinn to go to the next slide. So some overarching things that we want to make sure that you are aware of, and just to make sure I'm clear, these slides from the terminology section were sent to you already, so we're going to move through them pretty quickly, but if you do have specific questions, please do put them in the chat. I still have it open on my screen so I can see them if you put them through. But just moving through this slide pretty quickly because you've already received it, right? We want to make sure that we remind you that sexuality and gender are spectrums of orientation, attraction, and identity, right? It's not just about behavior. It's not just about physical attraction, right? That there are a whole variety of components that come together to make someone's sexual orientation or their gender, right? And a spectrum versus like a continuum, right? A continuum is like a line with two ends. And so it still has a way of like reinforcing the binary ends, right? And so we want to kind of get rid of that continuum idea, get rid of the binary idea, and just know that if we were to like graph genders on a square, they're going to be plot points all over because gender and sexuality are both spectrums of orientation. For some people, their sexual orientation, sexuality, or gender might change over time, but it's always valid, right? Whether it's fluid or dynamic or changing, it is always valid, right? And so we want to make sure we're affirming folks in their gender and sexual orientation, and they may change over the course of us knowing them, and that's okay. They're still valid at all points. As I mentioned to you before, a question or an answer that I would provide to the question of like, why are there so many terms is this third point here, right? Getting to claim a label, find a word that fits my experience and describes it, and then finding someone else who also has that label and has a similar experience to me is very affirming and validating, and counteracts feelings of isolation, shame, and otherness, because someone else has that same experience that I do, right? So that's why we have so many terms. That's why we encourage people to create more because we want to make sure that we're fostering a sense of community for LGBTQ people by empowering them to claim their own identity. Finally, we want to make sure, a lot of people have questions like, what words should I use? What is the right thing to say? And so a good practice is just to always mirror the language that someone uses for themselves, right? If they are using the word queer, then you should use the word queer too. If they are using LGBT, then you can use LGBT as well, right? That when you're mirroring what someone else is saying to you, then you're gonna usually be right on track. Of course, all of these things are speaking a little bit more so to our cis and straight folks who are in the audience, right? LGBTQ folks who are participating, you get to use all the words that you want. Of course, there's some in-group language as well that like some of us queer and trans folks might use differently, right? But if you are not part of the community, these are some good standards of practice that will help you make sure that you're providing a good space, a welcoming space for LGBTQ people. I'm not seeing any questions, so we'll move forward, but continue to pose any questions if you have them. And Quinn, do you have access to the waiting room? Someone let me know that they were leaving and gonna come back, and so I didn't know if they needed to be let in from the waiting room, but there might not be anyone there. I just said that I would ask you about it as the host.
I don't see it, but typically like a little,
okay.
Like a little thing.
And someone else might have access or to like let people in from the waiting room. We just don't want to leave people there in purgatory because that's how it feels.
So we're going to do some breakout groups in just a second. So if you can, get yourself situated and ready to turn on your cameras and be engaged with other folks. You'll have about like 2 minutes before you do that. But one of the things that we did when we were rebranding and redoing our education initiatives, we asked our student staff, we're like, okay, there's a lot of terms, as Craig mentioned, right? So what are some of the terms that you really want UCSB to know, our campus to know, our community to know? And these were 4 of the terms that our students really wanted y'all to really dive with and really understand the difference in the definitions. So gender identity, gender expression, sex assigned at birth, and sexual orientation. So what we're going to do is we're going to do small breakout groups in just a second, and you're going to have 5 minutes in your breakout groups to match one of the terms to one of the definitions below on A through D, and then you're going to match the term and the definition to one of our symbols on our gender unicorn. Some of you might know this gender unicorn, might have seen this before, but this was borrowed from the Trans Student Educational Resource Organization. It's a national organization founded by trans folks for trans folks. It does a lot of trans identities and experience education and higher ed specifically. So we have the thought bubble, the hearts, the double helix, and then the green dots here. So one more time, you're gonna match the term to the definition to one of the 4 symbols in our gender unicorn. And when you have done that in your groups, we want you to think about this last question here as why do you think our students want you to know the difference? Why are we spending some time in breakout groups trying to tease out these 4 terms? You should have this as you should have this slide already because we sent this, but if you don't have that easily available, this will be a good time to do a screenshot or to take a picture with your phone so you have it when you do your breakout groups. So I'm gonna just like wait like 2 seconds for y'all to take a picture of it or screenshot it or find it in your computer. Awesome. So I have to stop sharing my screen. So I'm gonna do that for just a sec. And then I'm gonna do some breakout groups. All right, so I'm creating the breakout groups. We're gonna come back at 2:55 and I'm opening them now. Bye, y'all. We understand that 5 minutes is not enough time, so we understand that, but thank you so much for hanging in there as we try to navigate just 2 hours of our time together. So normally in person, we would like tease each one out, but just for the sake of time and also on Zoom, I'm gonna give you the answers. And I just like, so let me, oh, there it is. So go ahead and start matching your answers. I don't see people being super upset, so that's a good sign. Okay, I see some smiles. Okay. Awesome. So gender identity, right, is that felt internal sense of gender, what our gender is, and that is represented by the thought bubble on our gender unicorn. And our gender expression is how a person outwardly expresses their gender or lack thereof. Expression can be through hair, through voice, through clothing, through mannerisms, really a lot of different variations that you can express your gender through makeup, through nail polish, really through a lot of things. And that is represented by the thought bubble, the green dots throughout our gender unicorn here, number 2. And everyone has a gender identity and everyone has a gender expression. Cis folks, trans folks, straight folks, queer folks, we all do. And they can be different, or they can correlate somehow. Right, sex assigned at birth is the assignment and classification as people as male, female, or intersex, and often based only on physical anatomy at birth. Typically, this is the easiest one for folks to match, and that's number 3, or the DNA or the double helix. We understand these definitions are really they're really general. Maybe y'all have talked about that in your groups, and they are general because this is a 101 training. Right, we're giving you a taste of this, and if you take our Trans 101 and our 201s in the future, we will dive more into this and the complications and the nuances of all of these things. So sex assigned at birth is actually way more complicated than just seeing the physical anatomy at birth. Right, and I think there's a lot of assumptions, and I think you saw intersex, so for folks who don't know what intersex is when someone doesn't have the typical male or female body. They might have different chromosomes, or they might have variations in the genitalia. It really just depends on the body, but it's not just not just male or female. There's a wide variety of how the sex assigned at birth can show up depending on who you are. And your sexual orientation refers to the patterns of attraction or lack thereof. Those are our hearts, our number 4 in our gender unicorn. We understand that this gender unicorn is not perfect. It's not a perfect visual of all of these concepts. Again, this gender unicorn is very simple, and these concepts are actually very complicated. But for our visual learners, we wanted to provide something because it's helpful just to match some of these together. Something that I've been wanting to say, and I will say because I have the floor here, but going back to sex assigned at birth, if you think about gender reveal parties, anybody heard the news? What happened? Yeah. All right, I have a lot to say about this, and I know I only have a few minutes, so I'm gonna just do a quick little rant and then move on. But gender reveal parties are my worst nightmares. They're like literally my worst nightmares because they're not gender reveal parties, right? They're actually sex assigned at birth parties because gender and sex assigned at birth are very two different things, and people can they don't have to correlate. Do some do? Yes. Do cis folks correlate their gender with a sex assigned at birth? Yes, but not all the time. So for folks who haven't heard, there was a gender reveal party this past weekend in San Bernardino, and it started a fire. It started a wildfire. It has burned up to 10,000 acres as of Tuesday, as of this morning, and it's only 16% contained, right? And we're in fire season right now. So I wanted to share that with y'all to be like, just first of all, end gender reveal parties. That's not a thing that we need. We don't need to put assumptions on babies even before they know what their gender is. But also be careful because wildfires are really awful and terrible, and displace a lot of people. So I just wanted to share that as if folks did not know that gender reveal parties can actually really harm the environment, as this example that I just shared. And I'm wondering if folks have any thoughts on the question that I posed earlier in the previous slide about why do you think our students want you to know the difference between these 4 terms? You can add that to the chat, and I'll give you maybe like a minute or so if folks want to add that to the chat. Also, if you want to unmute yourself and you feel courageous to do that, feel free to do that.
And I just wanted to make sure you know that there's some good chat action happening about the gender reveal parties and the fires. So Yeah, you could check that out. But just a reminder that for folks, Quinn invited you to share the response to the question on the previous slide about why we should know the difference among these 4 concepts.
Can I share real quick?
Yes,
Yeah.
please.
As I was talking to like my partner, I just felt that if we know, like if we're informed that we know how to use these terms, then we ourselves can become a safe space for people. We often talk about like having safe places like on the community, like on campus or like the actual room, but the more we know how to interact, the safe, like we ourselves can become a safe space for people. And I think that's kind of really important.
Hi, could I share something?
Yeah, of
If
course.
that's possible. Hi, my name is Michelle. My camera's not showing. But going along with the topic of gender reveal parties, and like I was just aware of like how that's been like a controversial topic of how like it's one like disrespectful regarding the baby, and also like the why should there be a necessary party that like for gender reveals. And like the original person that created it, I took this in a class. I learned about this in a class recently. But the person who originally created it, they even regretted themselves for establishing gender reveal parties because they didn't realize, how that ignores, like it shouldn't, the purpose of like revealing a baby's gender, it shouldn't be that important. Like it should validate the welcoming of a baby, welcoming a new person, stuff like that. But learning how gender reveal parties, is an issue. I was like learning about it. I was like, that does make sense. And I said it in the chat, but I was like, and I would even bring this topic up to my friends. I was like, there shouldn't be a need for gender reveal parties. And then my friend was like, yeah, we should have like zodiac sign reveal parties and stuff like that. And I'm like, that's cute. But yeah, and so yeah, I just wanted to share. And also like, I appreciate that you bring up that topic because I feel like that conversation about gender reveal parties should be brought up more because there's so many of them, but yeah.
I love the zodiac reveal parties. That is like the best thing in the world. Thank you so much for sharing. Yeah, I'm seeing some of the. Thank you for everyone who answered that question. I'm seeing it creates safe space for folks, not to make assumptions. Knowing the difference would make a huge difference in how we engage with people and how comfortable we make them feel around us. Yes, all of it. Yes. And I think, and if you think of anything else, feel free to keep adding it to the chat. But our students are tired, and I'm sure you all are tired of being someone looking at you and making so much assumptions by the way that you're dressed or by the way that you show up in spaces. And we hope that after we move on from the terminology, that we give you some tools so you don't make assumptions, aka pronouns, right? And asking about pronouns and what to do around pronouns. That's the first step in making sure that we are not assuming what anyone's gender is, what everyone's gender expression is, by just looking at them. Because our students oftentimes say, hey, I walk into a space and someone looks at my gender expression. Someone looks at the way that I'm dressed, right? Whether that's masculine, feminine, androgynous, or something else, right? And they make assumptions about my gender. Right? So if I'm dressed super feminine, people assume, oh, then you must be a woman. And the sex assigned at birth, you must be a female, and you must be attracted to men. Because those are the assumptions that are placed on us and we are socialized to have. And for us to move away from that and to unlearn that and deconstruct that and create spaces for LGBTQ folks is that we need to know the difference so we can educate others and be like, actually, no, that's not, you're conflating these things. And you need to like, right, me and Craig cannot be in every space. So for folks, it seems like y'all are really into this and you really know the history around these terms and how they show up in spaces. But now again, it's like we are handing on the baton to you. Take this information, take this activity and share it with your friends, right? Share it with your peers, share it with your professors so they understand what the difference is, so they don't make assumptions of students, specifically for our trans and non-binary students, because our trans and non-binary students are showing up to class, even on Zoom, right? And people are making a lot of assumptions about them just by the way that they show up in spaces. So I really thank you so much for the conversation. Feel free to keep adding onto it. I do want to say that there, and I can't take credit for this, Craig has mentioned this before in the Cuties, there is actually a good gender reveal party, and that's when trans folks get gender reveal parties and get to honor the gender that they are. And I think that's beautiful. Craig mentioned that a few weeks ago, and I was like, so if you have trans folks in your life, ask them if they want a gender reveal party, because I think that would be super validating. Don't just do it, but ask them if that's something that they would want to celebrate.
But don't plan the party right now when we're not allowed to have gatherings. And when you do, make sure it's socially distant and wear masks. Okay, COVID protections.
Yes. Moving on.
So we have some more terms that we want to talk through. Again, you have these already, so we'll move through them pretty quickly. I think I already alluded to the gender binary that here in the United States, we have this gender binary of man and woman. I mentioned the United States specifically because there are other countries that have more than two genders that are not only legally recognized, but culturally recognized and go back generations and centuries. So here in the United States, largely due to colonization, women and men is the binary that we have. And so we're trying to move away from that binary, move beyond it, kind of deconstruct it as much as we can. So non-binary is a term that some folks use to describe their gender. It either might be their gender or it might be an umbrella term to describe their gender, but is those folks who are in some way outside of the binary of man and woman that we have here in the United States. It's a pretty general definition because a lot of these labels have very specific meanings to individuals, right? And so we can't give you one definition that will apply to every single person. What we encourage you to do is if you have a close relationship with someone, when you have that relationship, you might be able to ask them what that word means for them, but don't just ask a random person who you meet for the first time. That's not an appropriate time to ask invasive questions about their gender or their sexual orientation. Also, always asking folks permission to ask questions about their identity is really important. Non-binary, as I said, is a general term that folks use that has a variety of meanings for them. So making sure to, check in individually with folks about what that might mean for them if you have that relationship. Trans is a prefix that indicates movement in someone's gender away from the sex that they were assigned at birth. So trans as a prefix, as I just mentioned, right, transportation, it indicates movements. So trans is a prefix to someone's gender, right? So a trans man, trans woman, right? Trans non-binary. Trans is a word that accompanies another word to describe someone's gender and indicate that movement away from that sex assigned at birth. We want to ensure that there's not one way that movement looks, right? There's no one way, there's no right way, right? That there are a lot of ways that people move in their gender away from the gender that is connected to the sex that they were assigned at birth, which is why trans is a prefix to another gender. And then cisgender, hopefully many of you know this term, but if not, cisgender or cis is also a prefix to a gender, right? So cis men and cis women are people whose gender aligns with that sex that they were assigned at birth throughout their entire life. Cis is a more recent term than trans, and for a long time it was trans and everyone else. And so cis is a word that is used to make sure that we have a label for people who are not trans, right? And so if you're talking about your gender and you are a cisgender person, saying cis man or cis woman is more accurate than just saying man or women, because trans men are men and trans women are women, right? And so you adding cis helps you to just be more accurate when you're talking about your own gender and describing it for others. There are some things in the chat that I just want to go look at really quickly. Someone shared that having people around who are mindful of their gender identity and pronouns has really empowered them to see their gender identity as a beautiful thing to explore rather than as a deviance, as something additional or abnormal. As I think someone said, right, like being a safe person, right? Sometimes we aren't in spaces ever that feel safe or comfortable where we can show up as our full selves, but we can with people, right? So thank you for the person who shared that reflection. And then there has been some other things that are sharing with everyone. So I don't need to repeat those. Y'all can just review those in the chat. So I think we can go to the next slide, Quinn.
Awesome. And again, we won't tease some of these terms, these last few definitions out, because you had this and you can review it. So outing, misgendering, and dead naming, those are things that happens quite often at UCSB and everywhere else for LGBTQ folks. So the question that I want to pose to you, and it's a self-reflection question, and I encourage you to answer it in your Senate meetings, is how does outing, misgendering, and dead naming come up in your work? And how can you make sure to minimize this? And it's a community effort, so you really do need to make sure that everyone's on board, everyone understands what these mean, the impact that it makes, and then ways to make sure to minimize some of this outing, misgendering, and dead naming. So please think about this question: how does it come up in your work and AS? And start talking about it in your Senate meetings, because these are things that our students experience all the time, even on remote learning. Great. So one of the ways that you can minimize misgendering is really knowing pronouns and the importance of pronouns, how to ask, and what to do when you mess up pronouns or you use the incorrect pronouns for folks. So we'll be spending some time on pronouns. We understand that you might be pretty well versed on pronouns already. So we really are encouraging you. So if you do have questions around pronouns or comments, this is the time, this is the section to do that. So when we're talking about pronouns in the context of LGBTQ folks, we're talking about third person pronouns. We have first person, which is I, we have second, which is you, and then we have third person, which is the most common ones are here on this infographic: she, her, hers, he, him, his, they, them, theirs, z, here, here, and herself, z, zir, zir, and zir self. Z is just another pronoun. It's another gender neutral, all gender encompassing pronoun, similar to they, them. It's just not super well, it's not really common. It's getting more common now. So if you do want to learn more about the history of Z, where it came, why it's spelled that way, we have an additional resource. We have a slide called additional resources, and it's called mypronouns.org, and it gives you the history of all the third person pronouns that you could ever dream about, and gives you the history, where it came from, why it's used, how it's used, things like that. Wanted to give a shout out again to the Trans Student Educational Resource Organization. They do amazing infographics. I really encourage you to check them out. They have so many more visuals, just like this one. One other thing that I wanted to add around pronouns before we go to how to ask is when we're asking someone their pronouns, we're not asking about gender. We're asking how they want to be referred to in the third person when we're not using their name. So there's a lot of confusion around that, and we want to just give you that language so you can share with others. Right? It's like, hey, the importance of pronouns is like, we're not asking about gender, we're just asking how you want to be referred to in the third person. Because we don't go up to someone random on the street, like I wouldn't go up to Craig and be like, and I don't know Craig, and be like, wow, you look like a Steve, so I'm gonna call you Steve even before I meet you or ask you. We don't do that in everyday life. That's not socially acceptable, right? We ask someone their name and not assume name. So we shouldn't assume pronouns either, because pronouns are just as unique as names. If anyone has taken a class with Dr. Lal Zimin, he's a professor in the Department of Linguistics, and he does a lot of like trainings of gender diversity with faculty. And he shares that example of like, you don't go up to someone and assume their name, so you shouldn't assume pronouns, because pronouns are just as unique as names. So we hope that you can start sharing that with people around you, so to debunk or to remind people that we're not asking about gender when we're asking about pronouns. We're just asking how they want to be referred to in the third person. So how do I ask? Now, it's important to ask people's pronouns, because again, we don't want to assume, because it's not socially acceptable to assume names, so we shouldn't assume pronouns. The best way is to share your pronouns first, because it gives people that that open, that opening for them to feel safe and also share their pronouns. We have an example here. You can change it up a little bit depending on how it flows out of your mouth. But my name is Quinn. I use they, them pronouns. What is your name and what pronouns do you use? right? Very simple, very easy. You're modeling that for people. And if people are still confused, you're like, wait, what do you mean pronouns? Then you might just need to do that extra education. Like, well, I might not use your name all the time. So what would you want me to use instead? And typically the most common ones are she, her, hers, he, him, his, they, them, theirs, and then they will decide which pronoun feels good for them. Oftentimes people are confused or don't like to be asked because they just don't know what you're asking. Oftentimes it's not about offending people because we have asked specifically trans and non-binary students, we keep asking them, and they said that they're constantly navigating their safety everywhere they go. So they will decide for themselves if they want to share their pronouns or not. So again, it's always important to ask. And then if they are confused, you can do that small education, be like, what would you want me to use if I'm not using your name? And people are like, oh, okay, he or she or they, and they will typically give you that. In group settings, it's a little bit different, but similar is you start off introductions in a meeting with pronouns. So there's an example there. Let's go around, say our name, our pronouns, if you feel comfortable, and major or position. Similar to the slide that we did in the beginning that Craig walked you through, where it listed off, okay, this is what we want you to do in your introductions. Name, pronouns, we listed off some common pronouns, and then position and function. We really encourage you to even take that slide from that PDF and put it in your presentations, right? Or copy it and put it on a whiteboard, or put it in the chat if you're doing a presentation over Zoom, so people know what you're asking of them. Because if people don't say their pronouns, it's probably because they forgot, not that they don't want to. So if you put that as an example, people will just read off the pronouns that feel good for them. So I know I talked a lot, so I'm wondering if folks have any questions, comments around how to ask around pronouns. We'll go on the next slide on pronoun expectations and talking about what to do if you use the incorrect pronouns. But if anybody has any questions, does anybody have any questions on how to ask? All right. If you do, feel free to add that in the chat, and Craig will read it off.
So we wanted to share some expectations around pronouns that we have. The first is if you make a mistake, and you likely will, Quinn and I do this work all the time. We've been thinking about pronouns for years and we're still making mistakes because it's just human. The best thing to do is quickly correct yourself, apologize, and move on. Right? So if you make a big deal out of it, if you're like, oh my gosh, Craig, I'm so sorry. I can't believe I used the wrong pronouns for you. I am terrible. That would then put me in the situation that I need to make someone who just used the wrong pronouns for me feel better, right? Like I need to make the person who just misgendered me feel better. And that's not how it should go, right? And so the thing to do is like, oops, I made a mistake. I need to correct myself and move forward. Oh, actually I meant he, and then move on. The thing about that though, right, is that if you make the same mistake over and over and over, then it's gonna have a really heavy impact, right? So once, twice, a quick mistake, apologizing and doing better, that's good, that's great, that's what you want to do. But if you keep making that mistake for someone, it will have a cumulative impact over time, right? And so when we say that don't make it a big deal, quickly apologize and move on, the then responsibility for the person who made that mistake moving forward is not to continue making that mistake. So we wanted to make sure to share that part of it as well. Maybe we should change that to, if you make a mistake, apologize, correct yourself, move on, and do better next time. Maybe that's what we need to add to that first statement there. Also, if someone else makes a mistake around you, then correcting them is important too, right? We all make mistakes and we want to do better. And the main thing that we need to do is stop the misgendering from reoccurring, right? So it's like, oh, actually Craig uses he and him pronouns, right? Maybe you'll just interject in the moment if you're in a group setting. Or maybe you'll follow up with someone afterward, like, hey, I just want to make sure to let you know that Craig uses he and him pronouns. So next time we're all together, just making sure that you're using the right pronouns for Craig. If you're in a group and a lot of people are misgendering one person, it might be a good idea to do introductions again, and make sure that you are having everybody remember the right pronouns for everyone else. Another technique that I used to use when I was in class and I was teaching, right? And let's say student A says something, and right, so like this may be in one of your meetings, one of your participants says something, and then there are like 3 other people who respond to that first person and they're using the wrong pronouns for that person. Something that I would do is I would say that person's name and then their pronouns right after it to remind people of the right pronouns that that person uses. So for example, I would say, oh yeah, so Craig, he said this thing, right? And he was really on point when he said that. And then others of you agreed with what he said, right? So that's a way that I'm saying Craig uses he pronouns, right? And that is a reminder to the group. So maybe that's something that you would do. And I'm sure that in your roles and associated students that you might be leading meetings, right? So for you as the person in the room who's leading that space, it's really important for you to make sure that the right pronouns are being used for everyone in the space. Yeah, so someone brought a really great point up, and we say this sometimes, so thank you for this reminder, that something that you might also do if someone corrects you is thank them for that correction, right? Appreciate them. Thank you for letting me know. I will make sure to do better next time. Maybe you could do that instead of an apology or in addition to an apology, whichever feels better for you. I know a lot of people in my life, including myself, apologize a lot when we maybe don't need to, but that's like a bad habit we're working on. So maybe saying thank you instead of sorry might be a way to appreciate that correction that was offered to you. And then someone else shared, oh, so sorry, let me pause for a minute to read this chat. Yeah, so there was a question about like teachers or meeting leaders requiring people to put their pronouns in their Zoom display names as opposed to giving them the option. We really encourage making that an option, like a strongly encouraged one, recommendation rather than a requirement. Just because we don't know why someone feels like they don't want to share their pronouns. It might feel outing to them, even though we're not asking for folks' gender. It might feel like they're outing themselves if they were to share their pronouns. And so we really encourage always having it be optional, but strongly encouraged. Like we really hope that you'll put your pronouns in your name, your display name, just so if we're referring to you, we can make sure that we're using the right pronouns for you. Might be some language that you would use. Also for others, making sure that you're checking in on people's pronouns and their display name if you're referring to them and something they've shared, because people are getting misgendered in Zoom settings as well. And so we want to make sure that we're addressing that also. If you can't ask about pronouns or don't know, using they and them is a good technique until you do know their pronouns, right? So if someone says to me that their pronouns are she or he, and I use they for them, that is misgendering them. And in particular, that might come up for binary trans people who say my pronouns are he or my pronouns are she, and then people are not using those pronouns for them. That is misgendering, right? So you can use they and them if you don't know for someone until you do know. Another technique that you might use, although this is a little bit complicated because we're not around people, but you can listen to how other people talk about someone. And if those people are closer to that other person, then they probably know the correct pronouns for that person and are using the right pronouns to talk about that person, right? So if I'm talking about Quinn, like Quinn and I work together, I know their pronouns, right? So like you can guess that if I'm using they and them to refer to Quinn, then those are Quinn's pronouns. And then finally, we're hoping that you will join us in this culture change that we're working on. When pronouns first were introduced in higher education, we were talking about people's preferred pronouns. What are your preferred pronouns? But you have heard us so far just asking, what are your pronouns? What pronouns do you use? We're moving away from preferred because the word preferred gives this misguided notion that it's a preference one for the person who's choosing it, right? Like, oh, well, if it's just their preference, then there's like a right thing underneath, right? And that's just not what we're doing here, right? Like they aren't preferring to use those pronouns. Those just are their pronouns, right? So what are your pronouns? What pronouns do you use? And then it's not a preference as to whether or not I get to use the pronouns that someone has told me that they use, right? Like I only will refer to someone by the pronouns that they tell me they use, right? So they're not preferred, they're just pronouns. Also, if you say preferred pronouns, because that's like what you've been saying for years now, and you're like gonna need to work to get that out of your language, that's okay too. Your vernacular, that's fine. You're not a terrible person if you say preferred pronouns. We're just like slowly working away, moving away from that preferred language. We'll acknowledge that it's a little bit tricky because we have a preferred name system on campus, but over the next year or so, that will actually change from being referred to as preferred name to lived name, which is like the opposite of dead name, right? And so we'll be referring to what is now called preferred name on campus as lived name. And so we will move away from preferred there as well. Someone had a question about like phone calls and getting gendered or misgendered over the phone with like honorifics, right? So sir, ma'am, Mr., Mrs. I think for us, you know, a good strategy for you all, if you're talking to someone, try not to unnecessarily gender them, right? Just like use their name, try to avoid pronouns. I know for some of us, it feels better to like use Mr. last name, but we just don't know, right? So like using folks' full names or just using their first name as opposed to some of those gendering aspects are things that we encourage you not to do, because then people who don't want to be misgendered won't be having that experience, right? So again, through your work on campus, if you can find ways to not unnecessarily gender folks, even when you're well-intentioned, that's a good practice to use.
Yeah, and then there's also like a gender neutral or gender encompassing honorific called mix, so MX dot. It's pronounced like mixing a bowl. So that's something that you can add. Maybe can you add that to the chat? Maybe that way people can see that. So I've gotten emails from folks who use like mixed Solis, and I'm like, wow, that's so great, because like they didn't like that wasn't misgendering, right? Because like they're like, I don't know what your gender is, so I'm not going to assume. So yeah, that's a really great great honorific to add to your vocabulary if you don't want to gender folks. You might, it's not super well known outside the LGBT community. Even within the LGBT community, it's still not super known. So you might just need to do some education. So someone's like, wait, what is that? You might be like, oh, it's a like gender neutral, gender encompassing honorific. So you might need to just do that education, like the quick telling people what it is.
So as we move to the next slide, I want to call attention to and emphasize something that Esme shared. Thank you so much for sharing, right? That some people use different pronouns, right? They use multiple pronouns. Maybe they don't just use she and her, maybe they use she and they, or he and they, right? And as Esme shared, usually they'll share in the order that they prefer the pronouns that you use, right? So, you know, if someone says she and they, then that first one, she, is what they would want you to use first. But perhaps they're also telling you that it's okay if you use either of those because those are the pronouns that they go by. I think this is the fourth little arrow down on this slide, right? So people can use multiple pronouns, all pronouns, or none at all. And if someone is telling you that they use all pronouns, that's not a trick, right? They're not like, there isn't a right answer. If they're telling you that they use all pronouns, then you can use any pronouns for them. And some people use no pronouns, right? So then you should just use their name. We want to remind you, in case you don't know already, that students at UCSB have the ability to go into gold and indicate their pronouns that will then show up on course rosters and in Gaucho space. Hopefully more systems soon will be getting pronouns as well. And that list of pronouns that's in gold comes from UC San Francisco. We are the third UC who has added pronouns into our university systems. And so we all have similar lists. So one day, if the entire UC system has a list, we can already be ahead of the curve by having that list already. We asked for like a checkbox option so you could check multiple. And unfortunately, I was told that technologically, that's more advanced than the systems that we have at the university. I don't know, that's not my specialty. I don't know IT things, but if you know more about IT things, you might know why that would break the system. So some people will choose other, please ask, and those are so they can tell folks that they use multiple pronouns and not just one pronoun. So just a reminder, pronouns take place of names. When we're asking about someone's pronouns, we're not asking for their gender. We're just wanting to make sure that we are referring to them in the way that they want to be referred to when we're talking about them in the third person. We've already told you a number of times what the most common pronouns used at UCSB are. So again, those are listed there. We encourage you to say the actual pronouns that you use and not other things, right? So I've definitely heard people say, I use male pronouns or I use feminine pronouns, and that doesn't actually tell us what pronouns that they use, right? Because someone whose gender expression is feminine could use any pronoun, and someone who is male could use any pronoun, right? And so we really want you to say, I use he, him, and his, I use they and she, I use they, them, and their, I use she and her, right? That you should say the actual pronouns that you use. Sometimes we get the question about like, why the sets? Why do we have the multiple, like, why are we not just saying I use he pronouns? And it's just to remind folks of the different parts of speech that pronouns are used for, right? It's used to show possession, it's used when you're the subject, it's used when you're an object, right? That's some grammar stuff that we learned a long time ago. And so that's why we say the multiple pronouns. I see the question about faculty in the chat, and I'll come to that in just a moment. We encourage you to introduce your pronouns even when you're not asked to, right? So if you're in a group setting and you're doing introductions, share your pronoun. I have shared a number of times in cuties that it's really kind of annoying to me when I'm in a room and I will share my pronouns even when I'm not asked to, and then the people after me don't share theirs. You know, I kind of hope that that's like the signal to like, hey, we're gonna start sharing our pronouns. Someone did have the recommendation in one of our cuties to, at the very beginning, when asked to do introductions, if pronouns aren't included, interrupt and ask for pronouns to also be included so everyone does it. So that's something that, a technique that you might use. But certainly if someone else in the room shares their pronouns, you hopefully will share your pronouns as well. And this moves into the next point about cisgender privilege and pronouns, right? So for me as a cisgender person, when I share that my pronouns are he, him, and his, people are probably like, oh yeah, I would have assumed that. So like, that's fine, right? That there's not a lot of, that just like, that there's not a lot of risk for me as a cisgender person. I'm not outing myself, right? I'm just saying, like reminding people that pronouns are important for everyone and we should always be doing that. There might be more risk involved for a trans or non-binary person to share their pronouns in a space when nobody else is, right? So as Quinn mentioned earlier, they're always navigating their safety. And so if no one else is sharing pronouns, they might not feel safe enough to be the only person in that space who will share their pronouns, and then they might be consistently misgendered. And so then they might not come back, they might not feel comfortable, they might not feel welcome, right? And so for those of us who are cisgender, if we can help to keep the conversations about pronouns continuing and more commonplace, then we're helping to take on some of that labor away from trans and non-binary folks so they don't have to do that labor all of the time, right? So we really encourage you to understand your privilege in that way. And if we could get to a place where, right, like pronouns were so commonplace that we're just all doing it all the time, that's what we're working towards. So yeah, wanted to share that. Quinn, I don't know if you wanted to talk about the next point.
Yeah, so as a trans non-binary person, right, like navigating misgendering is something that I do on a daily basis, less in my workspace, but I work at a Pride Center for a reason, right, because I get, you know, that's what I do. I work with trans folks and other LGBTQ folks, but for folks on the call who have to navigate being misgendered in the classroom, at home, in the workspace, with friends, right? And don't really know how to navigate that, how to address it, how to bring it up. I wanna just offer that I'm here to listen, to validate, and to brainstorm and give options to you as a fellow trans non-binary person, because I know how difficult that can be. But yeah, so I just wanted to offer that, and I'll figure out how to open the chat, but I will add my email to the chat. So in case people want to reach out to me and just kind of troubleshoot this, because I've had to do that for, since I've been out as trans, and I use they, them pronouns. So I wanted to offer that to you, that you are not alone, and there are people here for you that can help you and navigate misgendering and what that looks like. And I just want to emphasize, right, that the cis folks that are in this call, I really want you to remember what Craig just mentioned, right, is like always introduce your pronouns, even when you're not asked to, because as someone who uses they, them pronouns and can oftentimes be clockable, or folks can tell that I'm trans, right, or don't conform to what society expects of what my sex assign at birth is it's really hard when I go into meetings and I'm the only one introducing my pronouns, because that's a lot of part of my job, right, is to be visible as an LGBTQ person on campus. So when I'm the only one in a meeting doing that, I feel very alone. I feel very isolated, and I'm just like, well, I don't want to be here then, right? Like, then I don't really want to work with you, because you are not, you don't know how important pronouns are. Of course, I do that because coalition building is really important for our work, but it's so important to find the people in your space, in your meetings, in your committees that will always introduce themselves with pronouns, because it just feels so much nicer not being the only one in the room introducing pronouns. So when Craig or Dwayne, our program coordinator, does it, I'm like, okay, I know I'm not the only one in the room that's introducing pronouns. So the eyes are not just on me. And I think that's really important. So for cis folks, I really encourage you to start incorporating pronouns into your work and in your everyday interactions, because we're trying to normalize pronouns. Similar to how it's normal to ask someone their name, it should be normal to ask someone their pronouns.
So Quinn, I put your information in the chat so you don't have to about that. Yeah, as Manny just shared with you all, I think like put your pronouns wherever you can. I know that there was a move in recent weeks to add your pronouns to your like Instagram display name, right? Your bios on social media, your bios on through Associated Students, right? Wherever you can put your pronouns. Our goal is to make it as common as names, right? That was a question that was posed to me when we were incorporating pronouns into campus systems. They were like asking me, well, where do we want pronouns to be? And I said, ideally, at one point we'll get to a place wherever someone's name is, their pronouns will be right next to it, because pronouns are used as often as names are, if not more often, the more, we know someone, right? Or if we're in spaces together. So we talk about pronouns a lot. We want to ensure that this isn't the only concern that trans and non-binary people have, right? That there's a lot more work that we need to be doing collectively, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in the challenges slide when we get there in a couple minutes. But this is a big thing, right? What we hear from students is that this is one of the misgendering is one of the most common things that they experience on our campus. So a question that was posed in the chat, and Quinn, we can kind of team answer this, but the question was, do you have a suggestion on dealing with faculty on campus that consistently misgender students? So I don't know if you wanted to start, if you wanted me to start.
You can start.
Okay, I think as Quinn said, Quinn offered themselves as a person who you can brainstorm with on what to do if you're experiencing misgendering, and I think that is a thing with faculty as well, right? There are a number of strategies. If you feel comfortable, it says consistently misgender, so my guess is that maybe you've already talked to the faculty and brought it up with them, but that's a good first step. Sometimes relying on your TA and having your TA help address it with faculty is another strategy that you might use. You do have the option to report to Title IX for consistent misgendering in the classroom, and so submitting a Title IX complaint about faculty who are consistently misgendering you or other students. So those are some options. It can be really tricky. It can be really difficult. Where faculty is an ongoing area of work where we want to help them to be more welcoming for trans, non-binary, and other LGBTQ students in the classroom, and that is an ongoing project. So those are some suggestions, we are available to help. We can reach out to faculty on your behalf, maybe anonymously. We could say a student in your class shared with us that there's a lot of misgendering that's happening, so we want to know how we can support you on that. That might be another strategy as well. Quinn, I'm not sure if you would add anything.
No, I think you hit everything, but yeah, I just wanted to remind you, we do have a resource on at the RCSGD where we can reach out to your professors and TAs on your behalf, or anonymously, right? And just provide resources. Be like, hey, there's going to be a student who uses they, them pronouns in your classroom, or a trans student in your classroom, and we wanted to provide just information around pronouns, and that's what we do. We do an outreach to them, and if they want support, we meet with them, and we can do that work individually with the faculty or with the department. I've gotten a lot of requests, or like a lot of students talk to me, they're like, well, it's the whole department. It's not just the faculty. It's not just one professor. It's the whole department. And what we do is we reach out to them and be like, hey, we do these trainings for departments. Is your department interested in one? Let's set one up. And then we go through this content with the whole department. So that's also another option. So again, if you want to meet with me, shoot me an email, and then we can talk about these options and see which one you are interested in pursuing, because we really will take your lead. We also have helped students get out of their section and get to another section with other resources on campus. So we can't connect you because sometimes it's okay to leave that class, right? It's okay to switch sections, and that I want to normalize that as much as possible, because if it's not a safe environment, if it's not a comfortable environment for you, then you're not going to learn, and it's not beneficial for you. So we can also talk about that option too. I would want to maybe explore other options before we do that, change sections, or think of other classroom or other classes for you to take. But those are some options that I just wanted to share with y'all, that there are options for you, and just please reach out, and we'll brainstorm together.
So we had a question, but I think it kind of aligns with the next slide. Quinn, if you wanted to move on. The question was, apparently in Slack, there's an option to put your pronouns, but it doesn't display anywhere. So the person is wondering if we recommend them putting their pronouns next to their name so it's more visible.
Yes, I really do encourage that. We wanted to provide an email signature examples. We understand that your signature will look different than mine. This is mine, but notice that my pronouns are right under my name or right next to my name, because pronouns take place of names. We really do recommend that. I wouldn't recommend putting it at the end, because no one will look at it. And I've had students, and maybe you're thinking this as you're looking, as we're talking, is like, if students will think of that, well, maybe they were forced to do it, so that's why they put it at the end. Or maybe it was an afterthought, so that's why they didn't put it next to their name. So they're right, being intentional about where you put your pronouns is so important. Something that I haven't mentioned in this call, but I'm sure y'all know, is environmental cues are so important to LGBTQ people and to other marginalized folks. Right, so putting like a rainbow flag, if you have a physical office or in your background. I don't think you can see mine, but I have a trans flag there. Sorry, my screen was a little messed up. Or a trans flag, putting your pronouns, pronouns is important poster that we can provide you at the end of this seminar. Those environmental cues are so important to LGBTQ people, because we will notice, right? We'll be like, wow, you took the time to put this trans flag up in your wall because you know how important it is. So maybe I can be a little authentic with you. Maybe I can share a little bit about who I am with you. And that's just kind of what we've talked with students, and that's where, again, constantly navigating their safety, environmental cues are so important. So please put your, if you feel comfortable, please put your pronouns in your email signatures, either below your name or right next to your name. We also get, what's the difference between the dots and the dashes or the commas? It's okay, like you can choose whichever one. You can do dots, you can do commas, you can do dashes. It's really your aesthetic. I used to do dashes, and I met Craig, and Craig did dots, and it just changed my whole world. And I just love how clean it is, because the dashes can get a little clunky. So, it just depends on how you want to display your pronouns. Can I move on?
So we want to talk a little bit, we know we're running out of time as we always do. So we'll try and move quickly through the rest, but we want to talk a little bit about, our campus LGBTQ community and what's going on for queer and trans people at UCSB. So the first thing that we will do on the next slide is just remind you that the RCSGD, the Resource Center for Sexual and Gender Diversity, exists as the campus's, official LGBTQ resource. And we are trying to create a more welcoming, an inclusive UCSB for the LGBTQ community and all of those LGBTQ folks at their various intersections, right? And we support not only students, but staff and faculty as well. So if you have a staff or faculty who needs some support, let them know that the RCSGD supports them as well. We want to make sure you know about our website. There's a full list of resources here. We have a lot of resources on our website. Dwayne Mosby, our program coordinator, and then our student staff over the past couple years deserve all of the credit for helping to build out the website. Since I started in summer of 2018, when I got here, for some reason, our website was almost nothing. So we really built it up over the past couple years. And so we want you to go there, not only for resources for yourself, but if you're supporting a student who needs resources, check those out. The other thing that we will draw your attention to about our website is that all of our staff are listed on there. There are pictures if people feel comfortable. There are names and pronouns as well as short bios. What I know is true is that not all students want to meet with me. Maybe not all students want to meet with Quinn, right? Quinn is our first point of contact as the Associate Director for students, but any of our staff are available to meet with students, right? So if you are supporting a student who wants to get connected to the RCSGD, or you yourself do, you can go to our About the Staff pages. We have career staff and student staff, and get connected with someone maybe who shares your identity, your experience, your major, right? That those might be things that will help you to connect more to someone when you're getting connected to the RCSGD for the first time. So we want to make sure that you know about that as a resource, that any of our staff are available to meet with students. And although this isn't relevant right now, because we're not on campus, the SRB and the RCSGD are closed. We hope that they will be open maybe in 2021 at some point, maybe later this year. I guess we'll wait and see what the university tells us. But when we're on campus, we don't have to just meet in the RCSGD. For some students, it feels outing to come to our space because we kind of are the only thing that's going on. On the third floor of the SRB in that corner, there's just one CLAS classroom beyond us. And so students might not feel comfortable coming up there. And so when we're back together and able to meet in person, we're happy to meet in the USEN, in the library, in Isla Vista. We just want to make sure students get the support they need wherever they will feel most comfortable. So we wanted to make sure you knew about that. Quinn, I'm not sure if there's anything you would add for this slide.
Great, so we're gonna wrap up our time together talking a little bit about the UCSB challenges. We have other slides after this, but those are more informational. So some homework for you when you do get this PDF to look at the additional resources page. We have trans affirming action items that you can do right now, right after the seminar, to make sure that you're signaling to trans and non-binary folks that you took a training and understand, know a little bit about their identities and experiences on campus. But typically what we do breakout groups, but I don't know, Craig, should we not do breakout groups?
Yeah, I'm not sure how much they would time. They would have like 5 minutes.
Yeah, so see, we're just adapting to time here. So I guess we'll talk a little bit about the UCSB challenges. This is not an exhaustive list, but when we did meet with LGBTQ students, we're like, hey, this is what we want to create, a UCSB challenge slide. We want people to talk about it in their staff meetings, and what are some of the things that you want to highlight that are some of the challenges for LGBTQ folks. And these were some of the things that came up for our students. This is, again, want to say this is not an exhaustive list. So if you do have things to add that are missing on here, feel free to add that to the chat, and we'll collect that information and add it. We're constantly adding to it. So the lack of queer and trans knowledge at UCSB is something that you probably already know, is a challenge for folks. People don't know what the acronym stands for. People don't know the difference between gender identity, gender expression, sex assigned at birth, and sexual orientation. And that's like the ground level, right? That's the basics. And if folks don't have the basics, then how the heck are they how are they? I can talk. It's like 10 minutes. It's fine. I can talk. They're not going to feel comfortable supporting LGBTQ folks if they don't know the basics, right? So this is why we do trainings. There is also a lack of queer and trans representation at UCSB, and that also goes for Black, Indigenous, and staff, faculty of color. So that's definitely something that our LGBT students are experiencing, is that if they don't see themselves reflected in the classroom, with staff, in housing, then they're not going to feel welcome. They're not going to feel like they belong at UCSB. We also just added this recently because now we're on Zoom and now there's remote learning. So there's challenges with that being LGBTQ, because specifically with breakout groups is something that a trans student talked to me about just recently. They're like, I hate doing breakout groups because I never know who's going to be in that breakout group. Are they going to be LGBTQ supportive? Are they going to look at me funny because, you know, I don't pass as a gender that I am, right? So there's all those layers of challenges now that we're on Zoom. Isla Vista, y'all know how Isla Vista can be, especially right now with all the parties right now during a pandemic. So UCSB doesn't have any jurisdiction really on Isla Vista. So a lot of LGBTQ folks have shared with us that they do not feel safe as an LGBTQ person, specifically trans femme folks don't feel safe walking down Isla Vista. So that's something that is definitely a challenge, because Isla Vista is part of our campus, although it's not at the same time. It's a weird dynamic. Greg, do you want to talk about lack of all gender restrooms?
Yeah, so one thing that we've been working on, and Associated Students is a shining example of this, where we've been trying to add and advocate for more all-gender restrooms on campus. We hear from trans and non-binary students that they just don't feel safe or comfortable or welcome in gender-specific restrooms. And so some students will not use those, and if they're in a building that doesn't have one, they're either having to hold it or travel to different buildings, maybe during classes or between classes, to find a safe and comfortable restroom. And so we're working on getting more all gender restrooms on campus. We know that, just so you all know, when we get to go back to campus, the second floor, right, in the MCC, those two restrooms right outside Associated Students' main offices are both all gender. Over the past couple years, we've added over 10 multi-user all gender restrooms on campus, and we're going to continue advocating for more. So if you are a student who's in an apartment in a building that doesn't have any all gender restrooms, we're always looking for student support. Because often people are like, well, do students want this? What do students think? So if you're in a building and you know there's not an all gender restroom and you want us to advocate for one there, please do let us know, because we would love to do that and try and get more of those on campus. We're working on a policy that would require at least one all gender restroom in every building on campus. That hasn't passed yet, though, or been approved. So that's hopefully coming in the future. But for now, we invite you to help us in that work in getting more of those restrooms on campus. I do want to acknowledge a challenge that was added in the chat that may have been connected to a question that someone else posed earlier, but someone shared that there are microaggressions from cis and straight folks, but also from cis or white folks within the LGBTQ community for BIPOC, queer and trans folks. And so I think a question that was posed earlier was like, what about exclusion from members within the community toward other members of the community? And I think, I wasn't sure exactly what that question was, but the way I interpreted it is like, racism and misogyny and ableism and classism exist within the LGBTQ community, right? I don't know who to credit for this phrase, but someone said, right, like your queerness does not absolve you from your white privilege, right? And so for my fellow white, queer, and trans folks who are in the audience, right, like we have work to do around racial justice. My fellow cis men, right, we have work to do around transphobia and around sexism, right? So like that's a really important point that we need to remember, is that the justice work, in that it's part of supporting LGBTQ people also need to be actively engaged in these justice movements ourselves, because those problems exist within our community, not just outside of them. So that was maybe a little jumbled, but I wanted to like make that point of like, there is work to be done within the community as well as outside of community across other oppressions than just, homophobia, heterosexism, cissexism, transphobia. Did you want me to talk through any of the others, Quinn, or?
No, I think we're gonna wrap up this slide. But again, you have a copy of this. We'll have a copy of this as a PDF. So again, another action item for you as 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 a whole is to take this challenge slide, go to a meeting, right? Go to your individual committees and be like, okay, these are the challenges that LGBTQ folks are experiencing. Some of the challenges that LGBTQ folks are experiencing on campus. How can we as a committee, right? How can specifically I'm thinking about, right? We work very closely with Trans Queer Commission or CAUSEWeb, right? Like, how can your individual committees address some of these challenges and help reduce some of these barriers for our LGBTQ students? So if you do need, again, remind you that we do consult with you. So if you do want to meet with us, talk through some of these challenges, maybe figure out how you can minimize some of these challenges and barriers, please let us know. We're always happy. One of the greatest things that we get to do at UCSB is work with students, right? That's why we work in higher education, to make sure that you have the tools, the knowledge, the education, and the support, the institutional support to do this work with us. So please take this to your meetings, to your committees, and start talking about them as a group and see how you can address some of these challenges. So just quickly, if you want to learn more about the impacts of COVID-19 for LGBTQ folks, we have some more information, but just for the sake of time, we're not going to dive too much into it, but please read this, because LGBTQ folks have been disproportionately impacted by COVID-19. It gives you a little bit about how that's been. And we're going to end here on ways to get involved. So please connect with us, collaborate with us in an event or an initiative through your specific committee. We're always looking for collaborations. Our program coordinator, Dwayne Mosby, is always wanting to do collaborations and events. He's currently doing our fall calendar, so this is a really great time to connect with him and get a virtual event on the calendar, and we can publicize it and create some social media flyers and things like that. We also have a mentorship program. So if you are LGBTQ and want to get connected to a mentor that's also LGBTQ, as staff, faculty, or graduate student, feel free to join our mentorship program. It starts in the fall and it continues the whole academic year. And then we also have a trans task force at UCSB. It's made up of student, staff, and faculty that just want to make UCSB better for all genders, specifically for trans and non-binary folks. And these below are the multiple committees that you can join. The one that's bolded is like the one that we really encourage you to join. It's a student engagement subcommittee. It's made up of students and they really give us direction on how the trans task force should go. What are some of the challenges that we should be addressing right now and focusing on right now? So if you do want to join that, feel free to email Craig. And then our meetings are starting up in the fall. And we also have an out list that renews every fall. So that will be coming, the registration for it will be coming out soon for National Coming Out Day in October. And anyone can join. You don't have to be LGBTQ. You can be a support person. So we have students who do look at that. I've sat with students and looked through like, okay, who's out in the physics department, or who's a support person for LGBT folks in the physics department, and we walk through that, we go through that list, and they're like, oh, this professor I'm going to take a class with them, right? So that's really important. Again, visibility is so important. So if you are on the out list, especially as a senator, students will notice and be like, maybe they will trust you, maybe they will go to you if they are experiencing something negative on campus. And that takes us to 4 o'clock. So I'm gonna stop sharing my screen and just pause the recording.